Thank you for viewing this YouTube archive of a Conscious Consumer Network broadcast. Please feel free to share it far and wide. Check out our weekly broadcast guide for weekly updates on scheduled broadcasts. Help keep us on the air by contributing to our network support fund. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or get in touch via email. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lady Liberty, and this is episode number 44. In this episode, we spend the hour with Alfie Kohn, a prolific and outspoken writer and speaker about topics surrounding human behavior, education, and parenting.
What are we trying to do? If our goal is to help kids become critical thinkers, lifelong learners who really enjoy thinking and reading and playing with numbers and ideas, if we want to help them become good learners and good people who can create and sustain a functioning democracy, then education would look very different from the way it looks right now, at least in our culture. We would have to question the use of grades. What research finds is that when kids are trying to get good grades in school, three things tend to happen. They begin to lose interest in the learning itself. Now the purpose is just to get a good grade rather than to engage with the question or problem at hand. Second, they tend to think less deeply and retain knowledge for a shorter period of time compared to kids who don't have any grades. And third, they tend to pick the easiest possible tasks. That's not because they're being lazy, it's because they're being rational. If we tell kids we want to see a better report card, we want to see higher grades, naturally they'll pick the shortest book or the easiest project because that maximizes the chance of achieving that goal. So regardless of what your goal is, if you're interested in assessing kids and teachers and schools to see are we doing a good job here, you would never need tests in order to see whether kids are learning and where they need help, and you would never need grades to report the results of the evaluation we place on those assessments. We would certainly do away with standardized testing, the kind of testing used in particular states or provinces where everyone takes the same test and then you compare everyone's scores. These tests tend to measure what matters least. It tends to be a good marker for family income because what standardized tests mostly measure is the size of the houses near a school. But it's the case that some of our deepest thinking kids just don't do well on tests. And some kids who get great scores have never had an original idea in their lives.
Well, I thought you just judged by tests.
Oh, no. There are many other things besides tests that we use. Of course, we do consider a child's general ability and the way he scores on standardized tests, But that's not all.
Competition builds character. In fact, what we find is that by any reasonable notion of character in terms of psychological health or self-esteem, that competition undermines that and creates a kind of neurosis, because we come to think of ourselves as good and competent only to the extent that we have defeated other people. And so we're always playing this desperate king of the mountain game, where we're all worried about triumphing over other people and stepping on their faces and looking at them as if they're going to step on our faces. That has two effects. One is it's horrible for us in terms of psychological development because there's a perpetual sense of disease and anxiety. But second, it very logically has a destructive effect on our relationships. It very logically has a destructive effect on our relationships. We compete because we're raised that way, not because we're born that way. I mean, take, for example, the belief in survival of the fittest, which is seen as a Darwinian notion. In fact, Charles Darwin never even used the phrase survival of the fittest. That was coined by a right-wing social thinker in the 19th century named Herbert Spencer, who tried to corrupt Darwin's thinking to his own reactionary political purposes. What Darwin talked about was natural selection, which means that the individual organism that's best able to adapt to a changing environment is more likely to be around to survive and reproduce. But that doesn't specify competition as a mechanism. In fact, often the active avoidance of competition, if not the deliberate pursuit of cooperative strategies, turns out to make it more likely that organisms and entire species will survive. The research consistently shows that competition not only isn't necessary for excellence, but tends to impede excellence on most tasks. And the more challenging the task, the more ingenuity, problem-solving skill it requires, the more competition tends to disrupt that achievement. Excellence pulls in one direction and competition pulls in another. And in fact, another kind of research study corroborates that. If you take a whole bunch of people and give them a task to do, some kind of problem to work out, and half of them are told, see if you can figure out how to do this task, and the other half are told, this is a contest with a prize to whoever wins, whoever does the best job, study after study after study across cultures, across gender, across ages, find that the people who have to compete, end up doing an inferior job on that task. At the moment, it appears as though much of what happens in schools in North America is really for the convenience of people who have most of the power. There is, if anything, an active discouragement of critical questioning. Corporations claim they want kids who are able to think outside the box, but only so far as they're caught within a larger box that works to the advantage of the free market, which means that the market economy, based on competition, based on economic rather than human considerations, ends up controlling the system.
Alfie Kohn's most recent of his 14 books are Schooling Beyond Measure and Other Unorthodox Essays About Education, in addition to The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom About Children and Parenting. Of his earlier titles, the best known are Punished by Rewards, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, Unconditional Parenting, and The Schools Our Children Deserve. Kohn has been described in Time magazine as perhaps the country's most outspoken critic of education's fixation on grades and test scores. His criticisms of competition and rewards have helped to shape the thinking of educators as well as parents and managers across the country and abroad. Kohn has been featured in hundreds of TV and radio programs, including The Today Show and 2 appearances on Oprah. He has been profiled in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, while his work has been debated in many other leading publications. Kohn lectures widely at universities and to school faculties, parent groups, and corporations. We are incredibly honored to have spent time with him and hope you enjoy this interview. So I have the distinct honor of sitting with Alfie Kohn today, and I cannot believe that we are about to have this incredible conversation. Alfie, could you please share with us, share with our audience your thoughts on what's not working in the modern education system in the United States?
I think a lot isn't working, beginning with the fact that education is generally justified or rationalized not as a way of either helping kids to become all that they can be and to meet their needs on the one hand, or helping to create a democratic society on the other hand. Rather, when you hear politicians talk about the need for education, they talk in economic terms, or even worse, in terms that involve competition, meaning our country or corporations will triumph over their counterparts overseas. And as soon as you hear education framed in those terms, it's not surprising to find that the mechanics, the how and the what of the education are not really doing justice to kids' intellectual, social, and moral needs. So what we find in many classrooms and schools, first of all, is an emphasis on filling kids with forgettable facts and having them repeat and rehearse skills in isolation, rather than becoming deep thinkers who understand ideas from the inside out. And we find that a lot of schools have kids separated from each other or even in competition with one another rather than in collaboration with, learning from and with one another. And schools also miss the mark not only in that they isolate kids from one another and isolate subjects from one another, and the second is important as well, because what we don't tend to have is a truly integrated study that's organized around problems and projects and questions. Instead, it's organized around facts, skills, and separate disciplines. But most schooling really doesn't have, as John Dewey said, the center of gravity inside the child. Rather, the center of gravity is outside the kid, in the curriculum, in a set of rules that were formulated before the people at the school ever met your child. And the job of the kid is to accommodate him or herself to those rules and to that curriculum. So I like to say that kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And schooling gets better to the extent that we bring students into the process and begin with the questions they have. And it's remarkable when that happens. I'm not suggesting that adults should simply stand by and wait for kids to express an interest in a topic all by themselves and in effect educate themselves. Unlike some people in the alternative education movement, I'm a strong believer in a very active role for the adult, a back and forth where we supply what is helpful in dialogue with kids, offering guidance, support, feedback, and access to resources and ideas they may not have thought of on their own. But that's very different from a more authoritarian top-down model that doesn't do justice to kids' questions and capacity for inquiry.
So what would a system look like if it was to integrate, this type of interaction that you speak about?
I don't think there's a single answer to that, which is why I've had the pleasure of visiting a lot of educational environments different from one another, all of which I find exciting and refreshing counterparts to the traditional model. I've written about many of the classrooms and schools that I've seen, and try to extract from them some principles of progressive education, because I locate myself on that continuum and in that that wonderful, with that pedigree, if you like, of what progressive education means, drawing from the work of many great thinkers who've come before me and some who are still living. So what I like to see is classrooms that really feel like democratic learning communities where kids are learning cooperatively, so that most of the time they're in pairs or small groups, sometimes doing stuff on their own, sometimes in conversation with everyone else in the class, but most of the time engaged in smaller groups. I like to see a place where the kids themselves have a lot to say about what they're learning and how best to learn it. And I don't just mean, again, deciding individually, this is what I want, so I'm going to go do it by myself, but rather deciding with give and take and trying to reach consensus with their peers about what we are going to be learning and why. And then also deciding how successful we've been and how we may want to make some changes going forward. I like to see learning environments, as I said a moment ago, organized around questions and problems and projects, where kids are acquiring knowledge and becoming more proficient at skills, but it's knowledge and skills in a context and for a purpose. Not just because this is the next page in the teacher's lesson plan or the next chapter in the textbook, or worse, the next on a list of standards handed down from Mount Olympus, that everybody's got to do one size fits all. So there's a lot more I could say about what it looks like. I like to see cross-age interaction, younger and older kids doing a fair amount of stuff together. I like to see kids engaging in ways to figure out how to be together, not just what we're going to read next. So when problems come up, interpersonal problems, the teacher's impulse is to call people together in a meeting to figure out what we can do. And where the adults have what I like to call a working with rather than a doing to relationship with the kids about virtually everything from what the room looks like to what we're going to study next, to how assessment works, to how we solve problems that come up.
Well, it sounds to me like you're really talking about a hybrid between the democratic education model and something that could be found in the public system. How do we get there?
Well, I'm trying to decide whether I agree with the premise of your question about what it is, but maybe it doesn't matter so much what we call it. This is not the same thing as what's often called democratic or free schooling or unschooling when parents do it. This is a progressive model that has this lineage that goes back to John Dewey and Jean Piaget and others, and as I say, provides for a very active role for the adults. This can be, and in some places is being done now in public as well as private schools. But where it isn't being done, it's not an easy matter to simply say, here's the recipe for how we get there. You have to look at what the barriers are, and there are many barriers, and I often, when I give lectures and workshops, I paint a picture of what I think this looks like. Sometimes I show a video of real classrooms, or I describe classrooms I visited and ask people to think about what their reaction is to it, how it departs from the traditional model. I offer research to suggest that this approach isn't just nicer and cooler, but also works better by any reasonable criteria. And the more ambitious your criteria in terms of depth of thinking and love of knowledge and learning, the more successful it is. And then I sometimes throw it open to the group and say, so why is this the exception? If it works so damn well, why is it so damn rare? And people come up with lots of interesting perspective explanations for this, and I've never heard one that I thought was stupid. I think they all They all make sense. People say, for example, there's fear in a toxically competitive culture. The idea that somebody else is going to get ahead through a traditional approach means I'm afraid to do something nobody else is doing. My kid or our kids will fall behind, since we see life as a race, which is part of the problem to begin with. Part of the problem is it takes more skill on the part of teachers to teach this way than it does either to say, go do and learn whatever you want and call on me whenever you need me, or to say, open your textbooks to chapter 7 and do the even-numbered questions at the end, and then we're going to do the next chapter tomorrow. What I'm talking about is much harder, not only because the teacher has to know more about the topic, but because the teacher has to also know more about how kids learn. And the focus is on the learning, not the teaching. Then again, it also takes more guts. It takes gumption, because if you're doing what it looks more like and sounds more like a jazz improvisation than playing a piece of music, a score, a chamber recital, you're not sure where this is going to go. And you have to have some trust in the kids. The less trust you have in kids, the more likely you are to control them. Or the more you need to control people in your life because you don't feel like you have much say about your own life, your own autonomy is in doubt, the more likely you are to say, I want to see all eyes on me, boys and girls, not because they need to do that to learn, but because you need the attention. So there's lots, and then there are the structural barriers that are in place now, like the whole top-down, corporate-style, test-driven, heavy-handed approach to school reform that lists, here's what every fourth grader must be able to do, and here's the test by which the kids, the teachers, the school district are all going to be evaluated and rewarded or punished based on the results. So there's a gun to your head saying, teach this stuff and raise the test scores, or else in an environment like that, it's extremely difficult, bordering on impossible for teachers to do what kids need in order to flourish intellectually.
So do you make a differentiation between flourishing intellectually and passionate learning, and maybe in compared to the definition of how we define education?
Well, education can be defined in all sorts of ways, but I think the interesting first part of the question raises the possibility that flourishing intellectually is a function of proficiency, how successful you are at certain intellectual tasks, and one's attitude or perspectives about those tasks. So the vast majority of criteria applied to decide how successful kids and schools are is just about academic achievement. At worse, it's often just about test scores, and they measure what matters least. So there's rarely a discussion about intellectual accomplishment. There's more of a focus on academics, and that's an important distinction that isn't often made. We need to be thinking about what it means for kids to make distinctions between apparently similar ideas and connections between apparently disparate ideas, to be able to take a procedure they've learned and generalize or transfer it to a different kind of problem. We want them to think critically, to remain curious, to be creative in the way they play with ideas. All of that has to do with how well they're doing, and all of that is directly related to how excited they are about doing it, which is to say that the best schooling situations are focused on, at the very least, how not to kill the curiosity that kids start with. And I'd like to do more than that. I'd like to define it a little more ambitiously. that's setting the bar rather low, but even that seems too high for many schools, which is how do we nourish and nurture kids' excitement about playing with words and playing with numbers and playing with ideas, to have a disposition to learn, a desire, what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. And when that's there, when the kids are really juiced up about what it is they're doing, then with the proper support, guidance, and resources from the adults and one another, they are more likely to reach a level of academic excellence, even by more ambitious definitions. So that's what I like to see, and that's what I think can happen in some exceptional places, is happening. But if you set your sights only in terms of number of skills mastered or number of facts temporarily retained, you're likely to see a lot less progress on those other more exciting notions of what education can be.
So do you think it is possible to create an alternative education, whether it's a system or an environment, that supports the whole child, that supports not only the intellectual, but the emotional, the social, and all the other aspects that we should be concerned about as parents?
Yes, it is possible, and I think some teachers and parents are doing that because they take it seriously. A lot of schools, most schools and school districts now pay lip service to the idea of the whole child. But then they don't seem to take it seriously. I mean, one example of that is they do act most of the day. After the kid gets home from school, the kid's supposed to do homework. In effect, kids are, when we say we value their emotional and social and artistic and physical growth, by the very act of giving homework and forcing kids to work what amounts to a second shift when they get home from a full day in school, we're saying to them, oh, by the way, all that other stuff doesn't really count. All we really care about is academics. That's why we're making you do even more of this when you get home. But so one, though not the only, but one indication that we're serious about other forms of kids' development is that we say 6 hours is enough. And if kids want to ride their bikes or cook or update their Facebook pages or hang out, just chill out with friends, or even by themselves for a while, maybe that's okay. After all, we adults want to chill out after a day of work. We don't have to be constructive up until the time our head hits the pillow. But then there's that question of what do we mean by constructive? And does it have to do with the other ways that kids learn? Some schools take this seriously. And I love these examples that I often use in my books and in my presentations of activities that simultaneously promote social and moral and emotional and intellectual growth. For example, when kids have to solve problems together in a class meeting, when they have to figure out how we're going to solve this problem because we disagree on how the classroom should be decorated. In forming a community and listening to one another's concerns, there is real moral development. They are becoming a social unit, a community, as they come together and take account of each other's preferences. And they're learning how to solve problems in a way that's quite analytical. So the same thing is true of cooperative learning when kids are in small groups. This is social, but it's also intellectual. So if we're careful about how these things are done, we're able to, let's say, feed lots of birds from the same feeder. I like that turn of phrase better than killing two birds with one stone, where metaphorically they have to die for our efficiency. So yes, and it's very important to attend to that. And for parents who send their kids to school, I would hope that parents insist on opportunities, if not during the school day, then certainly when the kids are home, for them to flourish and learn in ways that go beyond the academic, and not get so fearful or competitive or narrow in their thinking that all they're concerned about is how's my kid doing? You know, just in terms, to come back to that difference between academic accomplishment and love of learning, you know, for every 100 parents who get nervous that the curriculum at my kid's school isn't challenging enough, you know, isn't rigorous enough, you know, and they're concerned about, they're always focusing on how good is my kid as a reader. For every 100 parents doing that, there's like 1 or 2 parents whose first question is, why is my kid less excited about reading than she used to be? Less focused on the desire to read, you know, which drives the capability. But instead, they try to skip over, or are encouraged to skip over, the question of how they feel about what they're doing, and just immediately look at how do we ratchet up the difficulty level or the accomplishment.
Okay, so you brought up so many things here and so many ways we can go from there. I want to ask you something that occurred to me as I was listening to you speak. You talk about creating a non-competitive environment as the best nurturing environment for learning. How do you do that in a way where, well, how do you do that and still evaluate and test, you know, that your kids are learning something?
Well, you don't test, you assess. That's an important distinction. To assess is to gather information about how successful this process has been. And when teachers are assessing properly and mindfully, what they're mostly assessing is the success of their own teaching. Although that's convenient to forget when you locate the problem all, you know, inside the kid's head, or with the kid's attitude or motivation or whatever. And I would argue that it's really never necessary to test in order to assess. Tests tend to measure what matters least. And assessment can be done in a way that not only is not mostly about memorization with a standard pencil and paper, or take everything off your desks, you know, and then answer these questions by just drawing on your memory, which measures how good your rote memory is, how much stuff you've crammed into there, and how good you are at the discrete skill of test taking. And there are some kids who are very good at taking tests, even though they're not all that imaginative. And there are probably even more kids who are amazingly imaginative and good thinkers, but they just don't test well. So tests simultaneously overestimate and underestimate kids' capabilities. The other reason that the best teachers don't give tests, besides the fact that tests are not particularly good indicators, is that they're not necessary. In a classroom where kids are not hunched over worksheets or passively listening to the teacher lecture, where they're actively engaged in projects, where they're working in a small group to figure out how we're going to create a restaurant menu in Spanish, you know, not just memorize the conjugations of verbs, but put what we've learned into practice here, or where we're creating some sort of solution for figuring out how this, who caused this traffic accident that was staged for us, requiring us to draw from physics and math and social science and learning about the laws of the government and learning to write, all in the process of an interdisciplinary project. While they're learning and doing this, the teacher, by watching and listening, is assessing which capabilities, what knowledge store, which skills kids are able to call on as they work together to solve the problem. She's getting a constant stream of information to assess what's going on. And if we just want to stick with that arbitrary example for a minute, this comes back to the first part of your question. Not only is competition not required in order to gather that information, because you can do it with kids individually in terms of how well they're doing, and of kids in groups actively collaborating to learn,
But competition actually gets in the way, because to the extent you're focused on who's better than whom, you're talking about relative proficiencies. To say that my kid is the best in his class tells me nothing. It might let me brag, woohoo, you know, my kid's a winner, everybody else is a loser, which is a pretty shabby reason to take pride in anything. That is to say, at someone else's expense. But it really doesn't even provide information, you know, because how do I know how good the other kids are? What we're interested in is by some set of fixed criteria, or comparing my kid to where my kid was last month, we can get a sense of what's going on without ever saying, here's who's winning and here's who's losing. I mean, if you think about it for a minute, standardized tests, even when they're not norm reference standardized tests, when it's just standardized tests, meaning that all the kids in a given district or state or country are answering the same questions at the same age under the same conditions. Standardized tests are only necessary if the question you need to ask is who's beating whom. If your question was, how are kids learning? How successfully are they being taught? Then why would you have to standardize the thing? The standardization is all about ranking, not just rating, which is bad enough, reducing them to numbers, but ranking them. And, you know, no matter how well you teach and no matter how well the kids are learning, exactly 10% of those kids will always score in the top 10%. And half will always fall below the median and look like losers. Not because there's something wrong with our teachers, but because that's what median means, you know? So competition in so many ways, when it's kid against kid in spelling bees and awards assemblies and so on, or grading on a curve, or school against school, state against state, you know, or is America, oh no, we've dropped to nth on a list, you know. Why would we care? You know, unless you see learning as being like an athletic contest.
Good.
You got one more?
Yeah, no, this is great. Good points. And I was going to ask you about standardization, and you went there, so thank you. I don't want to end this conversation without asking you what parents can do. Parents that are concerned, that are in the system, and they feel as if they have no other options at this time. What can they do to support their children to find their love of learning?
I think what they can do specifically will depend on what's going on in their child's classroom and school. It will depend on the parents' tolerance for risk in becoming a troublemaker or being labeled as one. It will depend on the relationship the parent has with the teacher, and the kid with the teacher, and both of them with the principal. It will depend how many other parents share the parents' concerns about what's going on and would be willing to be mobilized, so that instead of a parent having to go in and say, my child used to love to read until you started requiring those bleeping reading logs, and saying that was only a B+, and now my kid doesn't want to do this anymore. If you have 5 parents or 10 parents coming down together saying, respectfully, our children will no longer take part in this activity, and by the way, here's some research supporting the destructiveness of this, but even if you don't buy that, it's not right for our kids. Let's talk together about what they can do instead that will help preserve and support their interest in reading and their ability to do it well. It will depend. Some parents will have to immunize their children, give them a kind of metaphorical inoculation, so that what's going on in the school and classroom doesn't kill what they love. Parents should not be asking their children questions that deal with how well they're doing in school, like what grade did you get, or what did the teacher think of this essay. parents should be asking questions about what kids are doing in school. Why did you think the author ended the book that way when it seemed to just stop in the middle? How would you have ended it if you were writing it? Would you like to read other books by the same author? You know, what do you think what other topics do you think she writes about? Why do you think the Civil War got started in this country when it did, since you're learning about that? Do you have any guesses at this point? Do you want to look up more online? The questions are about the learning, not about the levels of achievement, if parents want to preserve kids' motivation. Grades have to be made as invisible as possible for as long as possible. That's a short-term stopgap solution. Ultimately, the better solution is how we work together and organize to stop grades, because some of the best schools in this country do not give grades at all. And those kids are learning much more successfully as well as more enthusiastically. To the extent you're in a public school in this country and facing standardized tests, you're not just looking at X number of hours wasted on making your kids take tests, you're looking at X number of weeks or months wasted because the entire curriculum is geared to raising scores on the tests, and every minute spent helping kids do better on a standardized test is a minute not spent helping kids to become critical thinkers and creative learners, which is why, happily, there is a growing boycott movement under the name Opt Out, with parents simply saying, my child will not be participating in the test. So a lot depends on the relationships involved, the particular issues of concern to the kids and parents, what seems to be the barrier, what seem to be the issues we think we can make most progress on, or the ones that keep us up at night. And the solutions and responses that parents will have will vary depending on how they answer all of those particular questions.
Thank you so much. Finally, can you say just a short, whatever you would like to say about praise? I know you've written about this extensively, and I think it's important for parents to hear this from your mouth.
Well, they can hear it or read it better, I think, in where I've taken the time and I have the citations. I mean, I've written about this extensively in books such as Punished by Rewards and Unconditional Parenting. And if you don't want to read a whole book, I have an article you can easily Google called 5 Reasons to Stop Saying Good Job. The quick answer is that praise is a verbal doggy biscuit. It is not about encouragement. It is about offering a reward for kids doing what we want, for pleasing us or impressing us. And there is a huge body of research that indicates that rewards, like punishments, are more about control than they are about giving kids the desire to do stuff that makes sense. And in fact, scores of studies have shown that the more you reward people for doing something, whether that's with a grade, a dollar, a sticker, or a good job, when you reward kids for doing something, they tend to become less interested in whatever they had to do to get that reward. That's the first bundle of answers, have to do with how intrinsic motivation tends to be depleted when we give kids a doggy biscuit for jumping through our hoops. And the fact that it's a verbal one is no different than if we gave them a candy bar or a dollar bill for it. It's a way of doing things to children, not working with children. And the fact that people seem to respond positively to praise makes us forget that it's mostly manipulation, because that's not what kids need, which leads me to my second quick answer now, which is praise is a form of conditional affection. It says, you must do this in order to get that. You have to jump through the hoops. You have to earn, as if it were an economic transaction, my smile, my high five, thumbs up, big hug, my good job. I don't give it for free, of course. And that's the opposite of what kids need, which isn't just to be, kids don't just need acknowledgement and attention and care and love. They need acknowledgement, attention, care, and love even when they screw up or fall short. They need to know that they're loved for no damn good reason. You know, that it's nothing they have to earn. It has to be unconditional. And even parents who, if you ask them, will say, of course I love my child unconditionally, are sometimes some of the worst offenders at the constant, good job, good job, good job, good running, good writing, good drawing, good breathing, good, you know, it's almost like parental Tourette syndrome where they can't stop themselves from judging kids, because praise is about judging, and a positive judgment ultimately is not much more constructive than a negative judgment. What kids need from us is guidance and support. They need us to ask them questions, to provide them with feedback, but they need all of those things in a framework of unconditional support. And praise, like its nasty mirror image timeout, which is the withdrawal of love from the child's point of view with young children. Praise, positive reinforcement, is not about providing kids with what they need to flourish. It's about a way to make them do whatever we happen to approve of. So the opposite of praise is not criticism, nor is it sullen silence. The opposite of praise is expressions of love for who the kid is, not what the kid does.
Thank you. Thank you for honoring us with your time and with your wisdom. I am so grateful. Thank you. Happy holidays and happy New Year.
Yep. Thanks so much for your interest.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We hope that you enjoyed that interview. It was so much fun speaking with Alfie, and I learned so much. I would like to thank Nina, as always, our fabulous producer, for putting together these incredible interviews, tirelessly working behind the scenes and making sure all the details are taken care of. Thank you, Nina. Your work is always so appreciated. And I'd also like to thank Belle and Biggie over at the Conscious Consumer Network. They provide an incredible platform for these discussions that take place nowhere else on the net. I am so grateful, and Nina and I both are so grateful to be a part of the Conscious Consumer Network and support the vision, and we're really, really pleased to be a part of this family. Finally, I wanted to say happy holidays and have a wonderful celebration wherever you are in the world. We are so happy to have been a part of your world for the last year. In February, we will be on the air for 1 year, and we couldn't have done this without you and your support. So thank you so much for continuing to support our show and watch it and share it with your friends. We are so incredibly grateful to be in your lives in this way. So wherever you are and whatever you do, continue always doing it for the love of learning.
The pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world should be the focus of every person on our planet. The reason it is not is because people are kept distracted by the illusions and deceit propagated by the corporately controlled mainstream media. In recent years, the rise in truly informed, savvy researchers and journalists who have all taken to the air in various capacities has given rise to a new genre of media. We have seen the explosion of truly free and independent media, and thus the need to create an ethical live broadcast network that facilitated these brave and tireless souls became apparent. With a great amount of research and meticulous planning, Conscious Consumer Network was created. CCN is a first-of-its-kind broadcast network that is specifically dedicated to free and independent media with absolutely no government control, corporate sponsorship, or advertising. The live broadcast network runs full-time with an average of 25 shows and live broadcasts a week. The high-definition live stream is free to view and is accessible from any computer terminal with online access, including laptops, tablets, smartphones, and smart TVs. All shows are archived onto YouTube and are freely available to view in order to educate and inform as many as we can without imposing monetary limitations. CCN was successfully launched on the 1st of January 2015 and has gone from strength to strength as we have improved and increased the capacities and functionalities of the network, as well as an ever-rotating and improving lineup of content which is broadcast daily. CCN is blessed to be the home of some of the hardest hitting, most cutting-edge, truly educational and informative materials. Catch interviews, reviews, and talk shows from the many different and beautiful perspectives from CCN's family of interviewers and broadcasters. Since the 1st of January 2015, we have produced over 800 shows. We have over 2 million YouTube minutes watched every month, and we have an average of 1 million hits a day on CCN's website. CCN is viewed in over 147 different countries and hosts broadcasters from 5 different continents. The time has now come to generate funding to keep CCN on the air for the duration of 2016. The total sum needed to continue broadcasting for 2016 is $60,000. This budget includes the replacement of computer equipment, the acquisition of secure servers, which are most needed as we keep getting hacked, plus the renewal of the broadcast license fee for 2016. This is a fraction of the annual budget used by mainstream media networks producing a similar quantity of content. This is what makes CCN so successful, unique, and accessible, is the ability to run a project of this size and reach on such minimal resources. CCN does not claim ownership over any of the material we produce and broadcast, as we firmly believe that information is the common heritage of all beings, and thus CCN belongs to you, the public, and it is up to you all to keep CCN going. CCN would like to thank those who have contributed to the network in the past with resources, content, information, time, and energy. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.